Is it wrong to demand that your partner, as a condition of the relationship, only sleep with and have romantic connection with you? Harry Chalmers says no. Kyle York says yes. Harry, first, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an independent philosopher, and I study some issues in metaethics, such as normative authority and simpliciter, but also more recently some issues in applied ethics, such as issues of friendship and philosophy of sex and love. And in that latter area, a particular issue that I'm especially interested in is the moral status of monogamy. And so looking forward to talking about it with the two of you here today.
And Kyle?
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a Ph.D. student at CU Boulder, and I guess, yeah, I don't know. My main interest at the moment is animal ethics, but I also am kind of interested in ethics of love too, and philosophy of love.
Okay, perfect. So just to get this going, some people might be wondering, how could there be anything wrong with monogamy at all? It seems like to many people a practice on a par with brushing one's teeth. It stands in no need of justification. So Harry, why does monogamy need a moral defense?
Sure. So when it comes to the moral objection to monogamy, at least the objection that I have, there's a certain thought experiment that I think is most helpful for illustrating it. And that thought experiment begins by imagining two partners who are in a romantic relationship, but they also have an unusual restriction that they place on each other, namely a restriction on having additional friends. So the idea is that each partner, in effect, says to the other, look, you can have me as a friend, you can view me as both your friend and your partner, that's fine. But if you make any additional friends, any friends outside of this relationship, then that's it, we're done. I will refuse to support that. I will end the relationship. And lots of people, when they think of this couple, when they think of this restriction, there's this sense that there's something really unsettling about it, that it just seems wrong for partners to place this restriction on each other on having additional friends. And certainly that's my reaction as well. And if we ask, why is it wrong? Then I think the most natural answer is that it's wrong because friendship is an important human good. Friendships benefit our lives in various ways. They make our lives better. And so given that friendship enriches our life in various ways, it's very puzzling to see why one would want to restrict one's partner from having additional friends in their life. I think we could go even further and say that it just seems to be part of love for our partner, the love that we have, that one would be open to letting their partner have additional friends. Or at least, to the extent that one's partner is interested in having additional friends, one would be open to letting one's partner pursue those additional friendships as they see fit. And all of that, I think, is pretty straightforward. So far, so good. But where it gets interesting is when we note that not just friendships, but also sexual and romantic relationships seem like important human goods. They also seem to be a source of pleasure and closeness and learning and insight and just various good things that make our lives better. And so there's this question of if sexual and romantic relationships are in fact good in these ways, why would you want to restrict your partner from having more of them? If it's wrong to restrict your partner from having additional friends, isn't it also wrong to restrict them from having additional partners as one does in monogamy? Now, there are quite a few philosophers who will think of this thought experiment, this setup, and will say, yes, this poses us with a puzzle, namely, what is the morally relevant difference between the friendship restriction and monogamous restrictions? But some will say that there are good answers to this. There are, in fact, good reasons justifying monogamy that don't justify the friendship restriction. And so some of these reasons might be things having to do with practicality. Maybe just relationships require a lot of time and energy, and people's time and energy are limited, so maybe that makes monogamy make sense. Or maybe monogamy is needed to deal with jealousy, to prevent our lives from being just wrecked by the ravages of jealousy. Or maybe monogamy is best for raising children. So there are various things one could say to try to defend monogamy from the kind of objection that I've just described. Where my view comes in, and I think it's fair to say this is the crucial difference between Kyle's view and mine, is that those defenses of monogamy seem to me not to succeed. That I think that when we look more closely at the proposed reasons justifying monogamy, we find that they do not, in fact, hold up. And so, in light of that, if that claim is true, then I think it does seem to follow that monogamy is morally wrong, and that as part of our love for our partner, we should be open to letting them have additional partners if that's what they wish.
Okay, perfect. Kyle, now to you. Do you agree that monogamy stands in need of prima facie justification? And if so, what are some of the justifications you might give it?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I guess I agree with the setup of the argument for the most part, that it does look like it needs some sort of justification. I'm not entirely, so I will get in a moment to the things that I think might justify it, but I also, and I haven't got to hear Harry's thoughts on this, but I would be interested in his thoughts also on the notion that, like, what exactly is the difference between restricting your partner from something and then just having some conditions under which you're just willing to leave the relationship? Because a part of the debate, I think, could possibly be a misrepresentation, because I give this one example in my paper that, like, let's say that you come home and your partner is crying on the couch, and then you just completely ignore that, and then you go into the bedroom and watch TV, and then your partner is kind of like hurt. So part of how Harry frames the debate is by saying that, like, we impose costs on our partners when they stray from monogamy. That's part of how monogamy is enforced in relationships. But then it's not clear to me, like, what exactly the imposition of a cost is. So, like, in this scenario where you kind of go into the bedroom and watch TV and ignore your partner, and your partner in response gets very hurt, does that count as imposing a cost on you? And so, here's another kind of one that's closer to home. So let's say that you're just like, you come home and you see that your partner's browsing Tinder, and just as a result, you sort of lose some of your investment in the relationship. You're a little less interested in it. You're not really planning the future as much with this person. Is this the imposition of a cost, or is it just a sort of voluntary withdrawal from the relationship? So I thought maybe we could, like, talk about that for a second, and then get into the reasons.
Okay, Harry. Yeah, would you like to respond to that? So, where do you draw the line between restricting your partner and just placing a condition on the continuance of the relationship?
Yeah, so all of those cases to me would count as restrictions. So I think that in the first case, I believe you described of your partner crying and you not being very supportive of them. I think, yeah, the relevant restriction there would be maybe one never puts it this explicitly, but the idea would be, look, if we're going to stay in a relationship, you have to be someone who's at least minimally emotionally supportive of me. And I think it's entirely fair to describe that as a restriction. Now, do I think that that's a morally problematic restriction? No, I think a restriction like that has very good justification for it. It makes sense why partners would adopt that kind of restriction. Where I think that differs from monogamy is that it seems to me that monogamous restrictions are not justified. So that's where I would say the crucial feature is not so much like whether something counts as a restriction here, but whether the restriction is justified.
The only thing I could think to say in response is, so I guess in some cases it seems like, okay, maybe we should distinguish a few kinds of costs. So there's, like, I described, there's sanctionary costs, which are with the sort of explicit motivation to punish somebody or to enforce a restriction. And then there's merely causal costs, which are just costs that, let's say I hit you with my car on accident, and so I've imposed some sort of cost on you, but it's not for the purpose of enforcing any restriction or punishing you. So I guess, like, it seems more plausible to me that, like, in the TV watching case, it's a causal cost, and also in the case where you come home and you see your partner browsing Tinder, let's say that there's no, like, pre-existing agreement about whether the relationship's monogamous or not. but you might just feel less inclined to be invested in the relationship if you see that they're dating other people. So it's not clear to me that would be a sanctionary cost, but maybe do you think that maybe both kinds of cost can function as restrictions?
Yeah, I think that they can. And I mean, I like the discussion in your recent paper distinguishing between these kinds of costs. But my view would be that regardless of whether a cost is sanctionary or merely causal, that the very existence of that cost, or at least the anticipation of it, if one engages in the relevant behaviors, still suffices to set up a restriction. And in my view, the question is then simply whether the restriction is justified. Now, I am open to the thought that if the cost is sanctionary, then for it to be unjustified might make that worse than if the cost is merely causal. But it still seems to me that both would count as morally wrong. Now, in the case that you've described of, yeah, you see your partner browsing Tinder, and as a result, not for any sanctionary reason, but you just naturally happen to become less invested in them, is it okay for you to then withdraw from the relationship? I think what's interesting about this case is that it combines two features, and one of them is that one is ending or suppose one does end the relationship after seeing one's partner browse Tinder. Then, on my view, one would be ending the relationship without a good reason for doing so, which seems bad. But on the other hand, there's what's plausibly an excusing feature, namely the lack of attraction to my partner. And so a question that one might raise to my view here is, what do I say about this case? Do I say that it's wrong to withdraw from the relationship? And in your paper, you note that one thing I could say here, maybe your view is that this is the only thing I could say, is that to say that the partner who's considering withdrawing has a duty to work on that disposition, a duty to reconsider, to try to no longer have their attraction for their partner wane if the attraction waning is not for a good reason. And that's something that I do agree with. But I think there's one further thing I could say here, which is that whenever we have a case like this where one's partner is doing something that seems bad, or at least that one is committed to saying that it's bad, but there's also an excusing feature, then I think we can distinguish between the wrongness of the action and whether one is blameworthy for doing it. So in a case like this, I would be willing to say that perhaps you're not blameworthy for withdrawing for your partner if there's no longer any attraction. But to me, that seems separate from whether it's wrong. And given the stipulation, or at least given that my view would say that ending the relationship here is being done without a good reason, then I think it is fair to describe that as wrong, even if one is not blameworthy for doing it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering now. So let's say that in one of these cases, you just have a disposition to withdraw from the relationship. So it seems to me, I'm just making sure we're on the same page, that would you have in that case is sort of a duty to try to repair your disposition if you don't have a good reason for it. And that duty is incurred by the fact that you're in a committed relationship with that person. Does that sound like your view as well?
More or less. I mean, I think I would be willing to say that there's such a duty, at least to some extent, even if the relationship is not as committed. Maybe it's just a less strong duty. Maybe it weighs on us. It's not as serious a wrong to violate it in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think more or less something in that direction is fair to say. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we could move on to the reasons now. So the reasons I think were initially actually set out by. Should I call you Harry or Chalmers? What do you prefer? Because I'm so used to calling you Chalmers in the article, but it seems weird to do it in person. So I'll go with Harry if that's all right.
That's totally fine with me. For whatever it's worth, that was going to be my practice too. Is just call you Kyle here, and then in the papers save the last names for that.
Okay.
I was hoping you could both call me Wallen though.
Okay. So Harry is actually pretty much sets out the reasons in his initial paper, which made my job easy because I just had to defend them. So I think all of those are pretty much laid out in his work. The first one's practicality. The practicality means, is it easier to stay in a relationship if it's monogamous, or is it more tenable to be in a monogamous relationship? The next one, specialness. Does being in an exclusive relationship make it more special? One of them's jealousy. Could jealousy ever be used to justify monogamy? And I know I'm missing one. What's the missing one?
Was it specialness or
We did
children maybe?
specialness.
Or
Oh, there were a lot of reasons that Harry went into, like children and sexual health, that I actually thought that like they didn't justify monogamy, so I didn't bother with those ones. I think another reason that I give is intimacy, at least in the latest paper. So those are the reasons that I think can justify monogamy. I think that Harry's right that like some reasons, like children or sexual health, aren't very good defenses of monogamy, because I don't see why kids couldn't be happy in a different structure of family. So yeah.
Okay, so why don't you just pick a reason, and then you two can go back and forth on it for a bit. Then we can move to another one.
All right, we can start with practicality, as we tend to in the papers. All right, there's going to be a number of aspects to practicality. So we could start by talking about emotional resources, that each relationship that you're in takes up a lot of emotional resources, and people might want to limit the number of relationships they're in for that reason. And then another thing could be planning out your life together. So to me, it seems easier to make sure that you and another person can plan out a life together if you only have one other relationship. And the example in the paper that I give is, so imagine, everybody's living in the same town at the moment. They're in a, let's say, 3-person relationship. And then somebody has to move. And now the person who's in a relationship with both of those people has to make a choice of whether they're going to move with that person or stay and be with the other person. With all other things being held the same, like let's say that they can transfer their job if they wanted. So then this sort of an issue wouldn't come up in a monogamous relationship. So that could be a practical benefit, is just being able to plan a future out together. So that's my first spiel. I'll let Harry respond now.
okay, so yeah, thank you for that, Kyle. So I certainly do agree that some romantic relationships require a lot of emotional resources, but it also seems to me that there are many sexual and romantic relationships that do not require a great deal of emotional resources. And some that I have in mind are just, casual relationships, like if it's primarily sexual or more of a friends with benefits type thing. Well, monogamy would prohibit that just as much as the more serious relationships. And so I don't think that considerations of practicality would help justify that side of monogamous restrictions. Another consideration is that, well, I mean, a few other examples, there are restrictions on, sex while traveling or going to see sex workers. And I think those points also apply to the point about planning your life together, that it's not clear how giving your partner permission to have sex while traveling or to see a sex worker would pose any difficulties there. But perhaps a more important point is that for partners who do have this worry about, look, what if your relationship with someone else becomes emotionally significant? What if it becomes a committed relationship and then that person moves somewhere else? Are you going to move with them? Or are you going to stay with me? Wouldn't it be better just to not have to face that decision? But here there are a few things I would say, and one of them is that for any partners who do feel this concern, that one thing they could always do is just take the attitude toward each other of, this relationship comes first. We are primary partners, and while we might have additional relationships, we're going to favor this relationship. So one could embrace a hierarchical form of non-monogamy, and then I think if one were to do so, there wouldn't seem to be as much of a worry about losing each other to their partners moving. And I'll just make maybe one or two more points briefly, and so I don't go on too long, and then you can respond. It also just seems to me problematic to use planning your life together as a reason for monogamy given that monogamy would prohibit an additional relationship, an additional emotionally committed relationship, even in a case where the additional person being considered for a relationship is firmly tied to your community, where it's extremely unlikely that they're ever going to move. And so I think that for monogamy to prohibit even that kind of relationship, I think that there would still be a moral problem there.
Okay. Cool. By the way, I'd love to talk to you about normative authority and all that at some point too. But because the first thing I just want to say here is I want to make it clear that I think that whether or not monogamy or non-monogamy is a good form of relationship is always going to be dependent on the people involved and their particular values and desires. So I don't think that monogamy is necessarily superior to non-monogamy. I just think that it can be superior for some people. So depending on what they want. So I will address though these. So the other thing about the practicality defense is that I don't think it's going to rule out all sorts of breaches from monogamy. Like, probably right that it won't rule out anonymous casual sex. So that will have to be done with some other defense. What I'm looking for from the practicality defense is just to rule out some prototypical cases of outside relationships, which I think is important. So I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah, so I think the main concern I have with the practicality defense is these sort of more prototypical relationships. So anonymous sex probably wouldn't be ruled out by this particular defense. However, let's say casual sex or a friends with benefit situation, I at least contend in my paper that it doesn't seem like it's going to necessarily be a stable situation. I think a lot of the time we don't really know what things turn into. When you start sleeping with somebody, it might turn out that you really like them and you don't want to just keep it as a friends with benefit situation. So I don't trust that those sorts of situations could be stable, and that's why I think that the practicality defense can also apply to such cases, because then they will end up posing a practical obstacle to your relationship, or at least they'll risk doing so. And as for having a primary partner or a hierarchical relationship, I do have some like personal suspicions that would often not be nice to the secondary partner, but I can see in some situations that it might work if like both people are secondary to the other person. But I still think that such cases would be very likely unstable. You can't really predict how you're going to feel about somebody. You might very well change your feelings about them. So I don't think that these sorts of relationships can be usually predefined before you go in. And that's why I think that the practicality defense would still probably apply to most of those.
Okay, thank you for that, Kyle. So I'll say a few things about that. So on your last point that, yeah, you don't know for sure if even a hierarchical relationship will be stable. I mean, I suppose in a sense, I will concede that there's no certainty here, that one can't be certain. But it also seems to me that unless one's partner has given one a reason to distrust their commitments, then I think it would be unreasonably distrustful of one's partner not to trust the commitment they've made to the hierarchical relationship. Now, a broader point you made is that casual sex can easily become more emotionally significant. And so even if just one starts with a casual relationship with someone else, can one really trust that it won't become a more committed relationship? You've pointed out in your paper that having sex tends to make people behave in more relationship promoting ways. And so isn't this something that we have to take into account? But let's push this for a bit. Let's suppose that my partner does start a casual relationship with someone else and it becomes more significant, and that their new partner one day decides to move somewhere else, and that it's somewhere I'm unwilling or unable to move to. A lot of stipulations there, which I think makes me suggest that maybe this isn't the most common kind of case, but let's just go with it. And suppose that my partner decides to move with them, so that now I'm at least physically separated from my partner. Well, in a case like that, clearly it would be the case that this new person is very important to my partner. In fact, so important that my partner would be significantly more fulfilled with them than they would be with me. And so if my partner does decide to one day, or if they were to decide to leave for someone else, then that's a choice I would trust them to make. I would be happy for them. I don't think that it would be right for me to say, or to have the attitude of, look, if you start seeing someone else, then they might become so important to you and it might make your life so much better to be with them that you then might make changes to your life that I wouldn't like, such as leaving me. I think that there would be a fundamental selfishness there if I were to have that attitude toward my partner. And so to me, that's also a part of what seems problematic about monogamy here. And then one last point I'll make is that you've pointed out that, yes, the practicality defense doesn't rule out all breaches of monogamy, just some of them, and that for the others, we'll have to rely on some other defense. And that's fine as far as it goes. I do think it's worth pointing out here that what many people might have hoped for is that the defenses of monogamy, at least some of them, would be kind of freestanding, independent defenses. I think the more that it turns out they depend on each other, or the more it turns out that that they don't justify all of monogamy, then it has the result that by poking holes in any one defense is going to have broader implications than it might have otherwise had for whether monogamy is justified. But that's something we can talk about in more detail later. So anyway, I realized there was a lot there. If you want to follow up on any of those points, that's fine. But those were a few of the thoughts I had.
Yeah, and I know that, I mean, we're always going to have responses to each other, so I'll leave it up to Amos to tell us when to move on to the next reason. But I do have a quick reply here. So yeah, maybe we can get into the more broad theoretical point you just made a little later. I don't think I agree with that, at least in this case, because I think most of these do work as independent justifications. It's just not all of them cover all of the considerations. So the first thing that you were talking about is just trusting your partner to keep their commitments. Like if they have a pre-existing commitment to you, then whether or not they're dating somebody else, you should trust them to be able to keep that commitment. The only thought I have right now is that I think trusting them in that regard is trusting their capacity to keep commitments, trusting them as a commitment-keeping sort of person. And the concern that I have is that I think that a lot of the commitments that we enter into with people are implicit and not just explicit. So as I get closer to somebody, for example, and they open up about some very emotionally difficult thing, and I indicate to them that they're safe in opening up, I do think that in some way I have entered into an implicit commitment with them to be the sort of person that would take care of them emotionally in the relevant ways. I think that's how trust and opening up and intimacy works a lot of the time. And that a lot of the commitments we enter into are not going to necessarily be explicit promissory commitments, but instead implicit commitments. And then the last point that you made was about trading up, which is something that I talk about quite a lot in the paper. So when I say trading up, I mean when you, let's say, are dating two people and you decide that you like the new person more than you liked your old partner, and so you basically sort of switch and you spend, if not all your time, then at least most of your time with the new person, or you move with the new person or whatever. So I do agree. So this is a bit confusing because I do agree with Harry that, like, in a certain way, if I were a very good moral agent, I would be happy for my partner if they found somebody that they were happier with. What I find strange about this, though, is that it's the sort of attitude that I don't feel that I should have about if I were in that position. So I don't feel like I should have the attitude that if I ditch my partner for somebody who's better, that they should be happy for me and that it's fine because like they'll look, I'm happier. You wanted me to be happy. It seems like I don't know. To me, it seems kind of like a weird attitude to have. So those are my responses to those points that Harry's made.
What do you say, Amos? Would I be able to respond to those, or should we move on?
No, definitely. Wait, Kyle, how much longer can you go for?
I can go indefinitely. It's up to you.
Perfect. Okay, great. Then take as much time as you need. I'm going to just cover everything as much as you can. You don't have to stop now.
Okay. So you mentioned that trusting your partner is trusting their capacity to keep commitments, and that lots of our commitments are implicit. So in the case of the hierarchical monogamy, I mean, I do think there we have to make a distinction between the explicit and the implicit commitments. And so even though it does seem right that trusting your partner is trusting their capacity to keep commitments, I would think that in the case of hierarchical non-monogamy, the fact that there's an explicit commitment would likely give one at least some reason to trust that perhaps more than one that's merely implicit. But also, I would say that with your example, and I mean, this is an interesting example, and I know it's the one you describe in your paper of if someone opens up to you emotionally and you support them, doesn't that bring about an implicit commitment that you're the kind of person who's emotionally there for them, that you're going to be there for them? And I think there's a sense in which it does. So there's a sense in which it creates the implicit commitment that if they go on to tell you further, emotionally intimate things, or traumatic memories, or what have you, that you're the kind of person who's not put off by it, that you'll provide support as you're able. All of that's fine. If we're considering whether it's the kind of implicit commitment that you'll always be able to drop everything and spend time with them whenever they're having a crisis, then I think that would be going a little far. And I think that difference matters because to me, it seems like the only implicit commitment that is in fact made in a situation like that is one that would not threaten one's other relationships very much. So the implicit commitment to be the kind of person who's not put off by sharing of emotionally intimate details, or the implicit commitment to provide support as one is able. All of those seem perfectly compatible with whatever other relationships one might have. And that's especially the case if the other person here, the one who opens up emotionally, knows that I have additional relationships. Then I think they should not expect me to make, that they should not perceive any implicit commitments being made that would threaten my existing relationships. I think to the extent that they do, they're just being irrational. And then there was one final point, I believe, so I'm looking at my notes right here, about trading up. Oh yeah, and that it's an attitude. So yeah, the attitude of, look, I'll be happy for my partner if they leave for someone they're happier with. I just want what's best for them. It's an interesting point you're making here that, yeah, perhaps there's an asymmetry in that maybe that's a very commendable attitude to have. I think in your paper you even describe it as saint-like. But on the other hand, if you're the partner who's leaving, then it would seem insensitive at best to say, or to think, oh, well, it's fine because my partner should be happy for me that I'm leaving for someone I'm happy with. But I think here a lot depends on just what the thought process, what the emotional state is of the partner leaving. So on one hand, if the partner who's leaving doesn't have any sadness for the situation at all, or doesn't have any sense that this is going to be a difficult thing for one's partner, if one is particularly cavalier about it and just says, oh, well, they should be happy for me, then of course I agree that that's bad, because one is not taking seriously how difficult a situation it must be for one's partner. But if, on the other hand, one's attitude is, look, this is a very difficult situation for my partner, and so I will have a certain degree of sadness for that. Nevertheless, given that my well-being would be sufficiently greater with this other person. I would experience sufficiently more fulfillment that I believe this is the choice that is justified, all things considered, and I can justify that choice to my partner. Now, maybe it would take a great deal of maturity for my partner not to feel resentful about it, but to me, I don't think that this decision of leaving for a new partner is necessarily inconsonant with love, because it's the kind of decision that I think could be justified, in principle at least, to one's partner. So to me, that's, I guess, what I would say the crucial feature is here. It's not so much about whether one takes comfort in the decision, but just can the decision be justified to one's partner? And I think given the stipulations that we're making about the case, it seems to me that it can.
Okay, cool. All right, so there's a lot to go through. I've made notes. So I think the first thing is that maybe there's a kind of hierarchy between commitments. Is that fair? That am I getting you right? That maybe there could be a hierarchy of commitments. That my primary relationship has commitments that are going to like take precedence over other ones.
Yeah, I think when there's a primary relationship, then yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay, but more generally, you're just saying that maybe I do have pre-existing commitments, and so any other person would be irrational for taking me to be entering into an implicit commitment that would conflict with my pre-existing commitments. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. So I guess the only qualm I have about this is that it doesn't seem plausible to me that we can anticipate. First off, I don't think that implicit commitments tend to be as specific or quantifiable as explicit commitments, and so as a result, I think that as a result, I think that it's very hard to anticipate what exactly the commitments are and what they might entail in the long term. So, just to go back to the case that I was giving, so I don't think that the person being comforted or opening up to the other person is going to take the person that they're opening up to be committed to taking care of them in any sort of quantifiably specifiable extent. But I do think that there will be a certain sort of expectation of that person to be trustworthy. And now there also are going to be many ways in which that trustworthiness can be discharged. But I think that like the deeper you get into a relationship, the more of these sorts of expectations you're going to develop. They're going to just be the sorts of things that implicitly develop between people. I think is just part of what it is to go into a relationship. And the problem is that if they're not extremely specifiable, that there's no way to anticipate whether they're going to conflict with your other commitments. And so I think viewing your partner as a trustworthy person is also just viewing them as having these sorts of traits of keeping implicit and explicit commitments. I also don't necessarily think that explicit commitments are going to be more important than implicit ones. Now, I think we could think of a bunch of thought experiments that could bear that out, but I take it that that you're on board with that. So, okay, that's my response to the first part. Now, I wanted to talk again briefly about the trading up issue. So I do think that there's probably certainly going to be some cases where trading up is justifiable. It's going to be when there's an extremely large amount of harm at stake. I don't know, actually. I'd have to think more about it. I think there might also have to be some things that are really going wrong in the current relationship. I do understand the idea that your welfare might compel you sometimes to trade up, but I think that's going to be that should be experienced as an unexpected tragedy, as an encounter with some new values that you weren't anticipating, and that in a way breaks your heart. That's going to be sort of a crisis for everybody involved. So I don't think that the capacity to trade up in itself is a valuable thing that we should be seeking out. And so I think that being in a non-monogamous relationship raises the odds that you're going to trade up, and that's not necessarily something that anybody should be looking out for. If it happens, it's unfortunate. but it's not a valuable thing in itself that we should, want more opportunities for. So
Okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Harry, why don't you take the final word on this, and then on the next justification of monogamy, I'll give the last word to Kyle.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. So I'll just proceed in order. So you've mentioned that with implicit commitments, it tends to be a bit more nebulous, just what they are, what they might entail, than with explicit commitments. And I think that's right. I think that does tend to be the case. However, I think that what your view would really need here to push this as an objection to monogamy is a case where implicit commitments are made, plausible implicit commitments that would threaten existing relationships for one's partner. And I know there's the case you give in your paper, which is pretty much the one you just described of someone being very emotionally supportive for someone else. But it just seems to me that I'm still not able to see in that case what particular implicit commitments would be made that would threaten one's other relationships. Nor am I aware of any other cases where there would be any such implicit commitments. And so I think that unless such a case is forthcoming, then I think more needs to be said about to illustrate this as an objection to monogamy, or sorry, to the anti-monogamy view. For the trading up issue, so it sounds like, yes, we agree that trading up will sometimes be justifiable, but that should be, as you put it, an unanticipated tragedy, not something you foresee, and that we shouldn't be looking out to trade up, as it were. And here, I think actually I'm largely in agreement with you, but I don't think that the non-monogamous person is necessarily, at least non-monogamy as one should be doing it, as it's valuable to practice it, I don't think involves actively looking out to trade up. So it's not as if whenever one is with a partner, one is always thinking of, oh, who can I get with that would be better than this person? That would not seem like a very virtuous disposition to have. But I think the willingness to trade up doesn't have to take the form of having lots and lots of occurrent thoughts of comparing your partner to others. Instead, it can simply take the form of a disposition to if one is confronted with someone or meets someone whom one just naturally realizes in the process of interacting with them would be significantly more fulfilling to be with than one's current partner. And if one cannot be with them both, then one would be willing to get with that new person. It's not clear to me that there's anything wrong with that disposition. So I do think that yes, sometimes trading up situations do happen. I think non-monogamy actually has an easier time confronting these, since in a non-monogamous relationship, one can always, at least in principle, be with both people, whereas under monogamy, that option is just precluded from the very beginning. And so I know this is part of the paper where you talk about more later in your section on commitment, but I just wanted to flag that here. So those are some of my main thoughts on those points.
Okay, Kyle, I know there's more you want to say, but should we pivot onto a different defense of monogamy now? Which one do you want to go for next?
Well, we could actually transition pretty smoothly and keep talking about this under the new heading of commitment. But maybe we could do this one kind of briefly because we've covered a good bit of it now.
Okay.
So just to briefly set the stage again, and then I'll go into the responses. So commitment, I just think that monogamy makes it easier to be committed to somebody. In many ways, I think this is tied in a lot to practicality. So regarding trading up, I don't think that monogamous people or non-monogamous people think that trading up is a good thing that we should be seeking out. So I think that both of them would probably have an attitude that if it happens, it's going to be a sad thing. I guess what seems to me to be the relevant issue is just that monogamous people could make a pre-existing, by being monogamous, a pre-existing means of making trading up less likely. And so then if you were to say, but trading up could be a good thing, it could increase the welfare. It seems like, if you meet somebody better for you, then you should be with them. This is the sort of thing this is the sort of attitude that I take to be an overvaluation of trading up. So I don't take it that non-monogamous people have this overvaluation of it, but I think that in order to say that monogamous people shouldn't be monogamous for the purpose of avoiding trading up or making it less likely, that in making a response like that, you would be overvaluing trading up. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So thank you, Kyle. Let's just, I'll start with that last point. So thinking that trading up would be a good thing on balance, or maybe you wouldn't add the on balance, but I'm just going to say how I understand the point you just made. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. But it sounded like your point was that if one thinks that trading up is a good thing on balance, then that's an overvaluation of trading up. And yeah, here I disagree. I think that being willing to trade up when the difference in well-being is great enough. So not if it's just, one would be equally fulfilled with either partner, or maybe just, slightly more fulfilled with the other partner. But assuming that we have a significant difference in the potential well-being, then it seems to me that the willingness to trade up is simply the natural result of valuing your own well-being and your partner's well-being equally. That is your existing partner's well-being equally. So that is, you recognize that it's sad for them, but given the stipulation that you would be sufficiently better off with this new person, I think there's a certain role here for self-respect, for one's love for oneself to come in and justify the decision to trade up. So I don't think it's overvaluing it. It just seems to me to be valuing it exactly as one should, namely by being willing to do it when considerations of one's own well-being are significant enough and when that's at stake. And then for the first point you made, that monogamy allows people a means of making trading up less likely, I'm skeptical of that too, for a reason that touches on what I said earlier, which is that in any case in which one is monogamous but meets someone else who would be fulfilling to be with, then one can't pursue that option. And so the only way to be with this other person who would enhance one's life is to give up one's existing relationship. Whereas under non-monogamy, sure, maybe that won't always be possible, but there's at least the potential, at least in principle, it's possible for one to be with both at the same time. And so I think that by allowing this, by not forcing one's partner to choose between yourself and others, that can actually increase the stability and make trading up less of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So yeah, I'm glad we get to talk about this stuff. So I guess in response to the first thing, so I take it that you're saying that willingness to trade up is not in itself a bad thing. It just indicates a certain amount of, let's say, prudential rationality or self-respect. But I'm not sure that this conflicts with just wanting to limit the likelihood that this will happen. And that might seem weird, right? Because it's like, well, if another relationship is going to be better for you, then shouldn't you always sort of be maximally open to the possibility of that? But I take there to be sort of two reasons why that might not be the case. So I think Alistair Norcross has a really cool paper about how there's certain goods that you can only have by not comparing them to other goods, I think that the good of let's say a committed relationship is that sort of thing, that if you're always going to be comparing it to how good other things are, that you're not actually going to have the good of being in a committed relationship. So and we might set some limits on that, like maybe there are certain cases that will compel you to compare it to other relationships, but normally speaking, I think that being on the lookout for opportunities to trade up, or even just having a dispositional willingness to trade up that isn't, let's say, extremely limited, might actually prevent you from having the good of being in a committed relationship. Now, one reason to think that is that I think it could actually be kind of stressful even for you, and sort of deprive you of a good life if you're sort of, let's say, worried or stressed about whether you're in the best possible relationship. And I also take the attitude maybe to be a little bit consumeristic in that, I think one of the fundamental attitudes of consumerism is that we have these goods, but they're also like very replaceable, and that we can upgrade them and get better goods, and then we can use them up and then upgrade them. So I think it actually could be a lot more nice of a life if you just sort of stop worrying about whether you're in the best possible relationship and sort of focus on appreciating what you already have. Now, I want to quickly address the second thing, which is maybe non-monogamy actually makes it easier to avoid trading up because it's sort of, they have more of an attitude of the more the merrier. So I think maybe in some cases that's plausible. I think in other cases, so once your partner enters into another relationship where they're going to be sexually and romantically involved with somebody, I think it just makes the likelihood of trading up higher. And trading up doesn't necessarily have to mean that they're going to leave you. It could just mean that they're going to spend most of their time with this other person now or move in with this other person now. But I think that in certain ways, it at least seems just as plausible to me that monogamy can help avoiding worrying so much about whether your partner is going to trade up, because it would certainly take a lot, I think, if you're in a non-monogamous relationship and your partner gets a crush on somebody, then they might very well sleep with that person, and then things might become more intense over time. But if you're in a monogamous relationship, I don't think that usually you're going to register your partner having a crush on somebody as even a threat, because you know how important you are to each other, and you might even just enjoy the fact that they, still find other people attractive, but it's not going to worry you because nothing's going to happen. So I guess I'll just end it there and see what you have to say.
Okay, yeah. So thank you for that, Kyle. I guess I'll just start with this claim that about willingness to compare one's partner to others. And you mentioned that maybe giving up this disposition to compare could make one's life better. As you put it, you shouldn't be worried or stressed about whether you're in the best possible relationship. Well, I would agree, of course, it's not something you should be actively worrying about or stressing yourself over. But I think there's a way to be willing to compare one's partner to others that does not amount to always worrying about it or stressing oneself out about it. And I just have in mind a case of, for example, suppose that you and your partner just have fairly different interests, but you meet someone who's also passionate about an interest that you share, and your partner doesn't, and you talk about it with them for hours. And suddenly you find yourself with a lot of, oh, gee, wouldn't it be cool if my partner were also open to talking about this? And it doesn't seem to me that there's anything obviously that goes against love and noticing that. I don't think that love requires us to have a head in the sand attitude toward any ways in which our relationship with our partner is not as fulfilling as it could be, or maybe in certain aspects would not be as fulfilling as a relationship with someone else. And I think that actually is part of what makes love more meaningful, is that I know that my partner is with me, not because she, fails to see or fails to notice or just fails to think about the relevant, good comparative qualities in others, but precisely because in her very perception of those qualities, I measure up well. To me, that seems like a more genuine valuing than a valuing that is predicated either on ignorance or on not noticing or on not comparing. The second point you made was about how, if your partner starts seeing someone else, then even if they don't leave you for that person, they might still spend more time with them. It might deteriorate the quality of your relationship, and that would still be at least one sense of trading up. But here, this is partly returning to an earlier point I made, but there just seems to me to be something problematic in saying that, oh, well, if you start a relationship with someone else, then you might make changes to your lifestyle that I wouldn't like. And so I'm going to have the disposition that even if you were to know that your life would be made significantly better by being with a certain other person, I'm going to say you're not allowed to do that because you might go on to do something that I wouldn't like. I still think we have this problem of the fundamental selfishness there. And I think that a more selfless attitude toward one's partner, an attitude that's more consonant with love, would be open to the thought that, hey, if my partner does end up deciding to be with someone else, then that's something I will accept. I trust them to make that choice.
Okay, cool. So we've gone into a little bit of new territory. There's some stuff I'm going to cover that's in the paper, but I might stumble over myself a little bit. But okay, so I'm just thinking about the last point you made. I want to make sure that it's clear to me. So could you? I'm going to see if I got your point. Okay, so you're saying that it seems like shutting yourself off to other good possibilities would seem to be just a practically irrational thing, and maybe even not a nice way to treat yourself. And you don't necessarily have to be actively on the lookout for others, but you should have this dispositional willingness to, or maybe even a dispositional desire to leave your partner for somebody better if the opportunity should arise. So there's a couple things that I wanted to say about that. So I guess when I'm thinking about there being certain valuable things that you can have only by neglecting the comparison of those valuable things to other valuable things, I think promises is a good example. So I think there's a case that actually comes from Derek Parfit where he just is imagining a guy in the desert, and he needs a ride back into town. But this guy, he's a very committed egoist. So and also he's very bad at lying. So the problem is that anybody that he would promise to give them money for a ride in town, the person will see that the person's the guy who needs a ride is not going to actually give them the money once he gets into town. Because once he gets into town, he's going to think, well, what's the value of how would I benefit from now keeping my end of the promise? So I want to just imagine like a similar thing. Like it seems like being the sort of person who can keep promises and engage in promises with other people. You have to be willing to not compare the value of keeping those promises to other things, because otherwise you just lose the capacity to enter into promissory relationships with other people. If I'm constantly comparing like whether it would be better for me to keep my promise or not, even in terms of like not just egoism but utilitarian terms, then I'll lose out on the good of being able to engage in promissory relationships with other people. So I guess I have the feeling that monogamy would work in a similar way. That there's a certain form of committed relationship that you can be in only if you give up your willingness to be comparing it to other goods. So it might be that your welfare could be increased by a certain amount if you were to exit that relationship for one that is better for you. But actually having the attitude of being willing to leave your relationship in order to do that would actually make your life worse overall, because then you couldn't be in the sort of committed relationship that would otherwise have been valuable to you. And you just would lose the capacity to have those kinds of relationships. Now, there might be a difference in intuition here that like maybe you don't think those kinds of relationships are intrinsically valuable. We can maybe get into that. Okay, that's the sort of new thoughts that I have that I'm sure are going to be slightly incoherent. So moving back to the other stuff, I guess there's some other reasons to worry about the trading up disposition. So one of my worries is that it treats your partner as replaceable. And I think that one of the prototypical aspects of having a loving attitude is that the loved one is not treated as replaceable. They're taken as irreplaceable. There's a very easy thought experiment to bear this out. Let's say that your partner dies, but I say, don't worry, I have a exact robotic or even a clone of them. They have all the same properties as your original partner, so now you shouldn't be sad. But I think that generally speaking, we're going to not view our partners as replaceable in that way. And some philosophers of love, like Troy Jollymore, I think also think that being in a loving relationship with somebody also carries some other dispositional attitudes related to this, that it just makes he calls it, I think, silencing values of other people, that you're just less likely to notice or to respond to valuable properties that other people have. So these sorts of considerations, if they're right, make me wonder if having a, let's say, overly broad willingness to trade up is compatible with having a loving attitude towards your partner. So I'll end my response there and see what you have to say.
Okay. So yeah, let's take that in order. So for the parfait example, yeah, you have a committed egoist who's bad at lying. No one's going to give him money. But yeah, it seems that being the sort of person who engages in promises is able to keep promises. You have to be willing to not compare the value of keeping those promises to other things. But here it seems to be that, I mean, maybe I'm just misunderstanding the example. It seems that the egoist's failure is he's failing to take into account the value, maybe the moral value, might say, of keeping the promises, or the value to those other people. He's only thinking of prudential value. And of course, I agree that that's a fault. So in one's relationships, one shouldn't be thinking only of prudential value. But I don't think that the willingness to trade up suggests such a failure. I think that one could have the disposition or the willingness to trade up in certain limited circumstances, but still be fully taking into account one's partner's well-being and the moral value of that. It's just that in some cases, if the difference to one's own well-being is significant enough, then that will give one a sufficient reason for trading up. And so I don't think that the vicious disposition of not taking other people's well-being into account would necessarily be present here. For the point you made, though, about how the willingness to leave could make your life worse in certain ways, like you could lose the capacity for commitment, there my question would just be how to illustrate that, or how to give a plausible case in which that seems to be the case. Because for me, it seems that just being willing to trade up in certain limited circumstances where we have all the right stipulations in place, I don't think that would betray a lack of commitment as much as it would just the fact that one values one's partner's well-being and one's own well-being equally. Once we have that equal valuing, I think that just by its very nature, there are going to be some possible situations in which one has to favor one's own well-being over one's partner's. But I know one thing you might say here is, and this touches on the last point you made about treating your partner as replaceable, that if you're willing to trade up, maybe that is to problematically treat your partner as replaceable. And I agree that if it were, that would be a major problem here. But it seems to me that even when one does trade up, one need not be treating one's partner as replaceable. I think that it would be treating them as replaceable if one traded up and thought that there was no loss at all, that there was nothing regrettable about the situation, like changing one $20 bill for another. If one's treating one's partner as fungible in that way, then yeah, of course, that's a big problem. But just from the mere fact that one decides, look, with this other person, I would be sufficiently more fulfilled, that's fully compatible with realizing that some things are going to be lost about the previous relationship one had, that one's partner was special in certain ways, and that won't be replicated in the new relationship. And so, yes, I acknowledge partners are, in a very important sense, irreplaceable, and I just don't think that that's necessarily contradicted by the willingness to trade up in the relevant circumstances.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I'm going to let you take the final word, but feel free to ask Harry clarificatory questions in your response.
Okay, cool. So the last point you made was interesting. So I'm wondering if the fact that, I don't know, it just seems to me that if you replace your partner with a different partner, that in some sense you do treat them as replaceable. But I know that there will be some sort of like loss. So the loss can't be fully compensated for. I also wonder if we have a tendency to think of the value of our loved ones as, at least in certain ways, being very difficult to compare to other valuable things, including the value of being in other relationships. And if a willingness to trade up might also betray the attitude that one would prototypically take in a loving relationship as regarding the loved one as being having certain incomparable value to others. And also, so you mentioned that you're just saying that the willingness to trade up is going to be limited. It's going to be with all the right stipulations in place, and that's not something that I really want to like object to too much. But I would just say that seems compatible with a monogamous person's desire to limit to want to limit the likelihood that it's going to happen. So right, so you could have this attitude that maybe in certain extreme circumstances I would have to leave my relationship because my welfare compels me to. Uh, but it seems rational to have that attitude and to also hold the attitude that I would like to limit the likelihood and the frequency of such crises happening. So I guess that's all I have to say for now on this issue.
Okay, in that case, do you want to just pick another justification of monogamy and we'll go through that? Are there two more that you wanted to go through?
I guess there's specialness and intimacy and jealousy. We can maybe turn up the speed a little bit if you want, though.
Okay, yeah. I anticipate that jealousy will take up a lot of time.
Will it? Maybe. Okay. For me, it's not like a very important one, but it might end up being so.
Okay, well, yeah. Let's dash through jealousy now and go through the other two after.
Okay. So yeah, okay. So I guess I'll give the opening statement about jealousy because I'm on the I guess the defensive side, or I don't know how you want to do this. But I'll just say I think that me and Harry have a different sort of attitude regarding the jealousy defense. I think that Harry thinks that it's a very important defense, largely because, and maybe even the best defense, largely because he's not convinced that there's any actual positive reasons to be monogamous. But because I think there's a bunch of positive reasons to be monogamous, that I think jealousy is like the least interesting and least good defense. But I still think it works for some cases. So I don't think that jealousy is going to work for justifying a whole lot of restrictions. I think that these other considerations are going to be much more important. I think jealousy is mostly just going to justify the restriction of smaller, let's say, departures from monogamy that partners might want to depart from. So, let's take, for example, going to an anonymous sex club. So, if it seems like that would cause more jealousy than happiness, then it seems reasonable for a couple of partners to just agree to not go to the sex club. So I think for me, that's the large extent to which I want to use jealousy, although I might get into some other things about it later.
So yeah, thanks, Kyle. And I mean, yeah, I think it's fair to say that to me, jealousy does seem like a pretty important defense of monogamy, but there are defenders of monogamy like you and also Natasha McKeever who think that, look, jealousy just does not work very well as a defense of monogamy. And since and I do agree that a lot of it does hinge on whether the jealousy is rational. And so I take it your view would be that given all of the good making features of monogamy, given all the threats that non-monogamy can pose to a relationship, that jealousy is in many cases rational. And yeah, in those cases, perhaps the jealousy would be an additional reason why monogamy would be morally permissible. But really what would be doing most of the work is the positive good making features. So I agree with that. A lot of the battlefield here, so to speak, is going to be with the other defenses of monogamy. But yeah, and in your paper, I saw that, I mean, there are at least some things I say about jealousy that you seem to agree with. And one of them was that to the extent that a certain feeling is irrational or immature, then that does seem to significantly reduce, if not eliminate, the moral weight that it has, the extent to which it can justify restrictions on our behavior. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding your view, but yeah, I mean, that's the point that I would make here, is that if we are limiting ourselves to irrational jealousy, then I think that the fact that it's irrational is one reason to think that it's not going to do much to justify restrictions. And there are certain cases one can put forth to kind of support that judgment. So a few that I've described are, suppose that one has a friend who's very insecure and suppose that if you go to visit one of your other friends, then your first friend is going to feel really jealous about it. Does that give you a reason not to visit the second friend? And at least my intuitive judgment is that it doesn't. It's that the first friend's jealousy, that's his problem to bear, and that he should work on his feelings. And so, given that Kyle, that you think that jealousy is the least good defense of monogamy, there's a lot we could say about it, but I'm also perfectly happy to just kind of leave it on the back burner for this discussion if you'd like, and focus our attention elsewhere.
Yeah, that sounds good. I do like the case you gave of the third friend who would get jealous, so we shouldn't, so the other two friends are like, well, we shouldn't get together because it might make this guy jealous. That seems like a really bad reason for them to not get together, right? So I think that's a good case. I wonder if if you turned that one friend into a utility monster or something, then maybe we could push our intuitions in some way or another. But yeah, in general, I agree with that. And I guess the extent of the agreement shows that I just think the jealousy should be used to limit much less important cases than two loving people getting together. I think it should just be used to limit cases of casual sex. And especially if it's not very important to either partner, that they're able to have casual sex. So I'm happy to move on too, but I'll give you the last word on this if you want.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that there's a great deal to say. I think in general, I'm probably a little more optimistic than you are about people's capacity to regulate irrational feelings that they might have. But I think you're right that that's largely an empirical debate that's not really settled, at least when it comes to jealousy. And so probably it would be best just to set that aside here, unless, Amos, if you had anything you wanted to say about it or to ask us, you could. But
I don't. But yeah, we have two more justifications of monogamy to go through. What do you want to go through next?
Okay, so there's intimacy, and then there is specialness. I think specialness is actually going to be the hardest one to get through. So let's go with intimacy. So I think that there's some ways in which being in a monogamous relationship with somebody might increase the capacity for intimacy with that person than if you're both seeing multiple people. That's my basic claim. I'll leave it to Harry to bring some objections to that claim.
Okay, so my objection is how?
Okay. So here's a couple ways. So one way is that it seems that if you're in a non-monogamous relationship, you are going to enter into some sort of very personal, private interactions with other people that you won't be able to share with your pre-existing partner. And that this will undercut your capacity for intimacy with them. In particular, if these other experiences are very important to you, or if they are change you in some significant ways, or work towards defining your self-concept. So we could start with that one, and then we'll move on to the other one later.
Okay, yeah. So the thought seems to be, as I understand it, that look, if your partner makes an additional emotionally committed relationship, and then they have some deep conversations with this person, then suppose the other person is not okay with your partner sharing the details of those conversations with you, then isn't there an important sense in which you know your partner less well now than you did before? And doesn't that reduce the intimacy that you might have had? So here I would say a few things. One of them is that, in a way, this is reiterating an earlier point, but I think that this won't fully justify the range of monogamous restrictions, because monogamy would prohibit a relationship even with someone who is very open and would not wish to keep private any conversations they had. And so I think the intimacy objection would not extend that to that side of monogamous restrictions. But we can set that aside now, because I think that's not the most important point that there is to be made in response. One that I think is a bit more important is that let's just imagine a comparison to friendship. So imagine that you had before you the prospect of your partner becoming friends with someone else, and you know that this other person is the kind of person who really likes deep conversations, but is also a very private person. You know that if your partner were to become friends with them, then any deep conversations they had, this third person would not be okay with your partner sharing the details of those conversations with you. Would it be okay to prohibit your partner from being friends with that person? Now, I want to say no, that would be wrong. And the reason why it would be wrong is that even if it's right that I perhaps know my partner slightly less well than I would if I heard the details of those conversations, surely what matters much more here is that my partner has this new fulfilling deep relationship with this person, that they can have this kind of conversation. Surely that's a much more significant consideration than whether I feel a bit crestfallen at not getting to know what they talked about. And I think that's especially the case when we consider that it's not just this potentially very important relationship for my partner that's at stake, but also for the third person, for the third party. By preventing my partner from being in a relation or in a friendship with them or relationship with them, or what have you, I'm also making it the case that this third party is not able to have the benefits of that relationship. And so I think, especially when we consider their well-being, it just seems to me that it would be really wrong to prohibit my partner from having this. And if it's not justified in the case of preventing my partner from having a friendship with someone like this, then I don't see why it would be justified in the case of a romantic partner. And so there's a lot more I think that could be said, but maybe I'll just leave it there if you want to respond to any of that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm going to avoid talking about like harm to third parties, just because I think it's probably outside of the scope of the debate. Because what I want to focus on is just the harm to the partner. Although, you know, like maybe the third party would be better off being in a, you know, having meaningful interactions with somebody there where there will be less emotional complexity involved, and the extent to which they can bond and the differing competing commitments. But I guess, you know, we can think of some cases like a very open, non-monogamous person, or a very private friendship. But I guess I just think that in general, intimate romantic relationships are going to have a greater degree and frequency of these sort of private, unshareable connections than will friendships. And I think that when we're sort of agreeing on what kind of relationship we want to have, that we're going to think in general terms of the sorts of classes of relationships that we're going to restrict, because it'll be impossible to anticipate on a case-by-case basis ahead of time, and it'll probably be too difficult to do it during the course of the relationship. So it seems to make sense to me that people might just want to restrict broad classes of relationships based on the type that they tend to usually have, based on these sorts of considerations.
Okay, so yeah, I guess my point is, or my response to that is that this seems to place very little faith in partners' ability to negotiate difficulties as they arise and to work out acceptable solutions. That is the willingness to just put forth a blanket prohibition on a certain kind of relationship, rather than to take any difficulties as they come and to work it out with each other. And so I think that just that the initial sense in which that seems rather distrustful, whether of one's partner's capacity to negotiate those kinds of situations, or maybe of one's own capacity, that is just an initial observation that I think is worth making there. But also, even if there's the point you made that additional romantic relationships have a higher frequency of private, unshareable moments than friendships do. Well, one thing I would say here is that, I mean, there's typically the norm that, you know, otherwise private conversations and experiences you can still tell your partner about. And for all we know, it's quite possible that in a non-monogamous relationship that norm would apply to each partner. But suppose that it doesn't. Suppose that, you know, there are in fact these private moments, and, you know, the third person is not okay with having them shared. Then I think that sorry, I lost my train of thought. I think that the willingness to restrict one's partner from having those additional moments, to me, there seems to be that same selfishness there of being, in effect, willing to tell one's partner that I'm not okay with you having an additionally emotionally committed relationship, even if it would mean a great deal to you, because then I wouldn't get to know the content of your conversations. And I just don't think that's a weighing of values that can be justified. And that's, again, especially the case when we consider the third party here. I know you said that the third party is perhaps outside the scope of these considerations, but I don't think that the third party's well-being is outside the scope of anything here. I think that clearly their well-being matters morally, and if we have reason to believe that they would gain a great deal of fulfillment from a certain kind of relationship with their partner, then I don't think that that's something that we can set aside.
Okay, I mean, I wonder if so I just want to get your take on. I'm just thinking this through for the first time because we haven't brought up the third parties before. If I said to like my partner, like, it's really unfair to other people to hold me back from them because it would be so great for them to be with me that you're actually hurting them. I don't know, like maybe, but I guess it just seems like, well, if they don't end up with me, they're just gonna have other people that they're going to end up connecting to, and this is largely going to be very hard to predict the outcomes of these sorts of things once you get to consideration of the futures of third-party people. So I don't know. I don't have a strong view on that, but I don't think I don't know. It doesn't seem to me likely that you're doing them much harm. So as with the sort of selfishness thing, yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't think of it in terms of not wanting your partner to have significant interactions with other people. It's rather the point is that two people might want to be in the sort of relationship where they don't end up in those circumstances in order to promote some other third value, right? So it's not, the valuable thing is not making sure your partner doesn't have nice experiences. The thing that the value that you're trying to promote is feeling especially close to your partner. And the other thing with the possibility of your partner having significant interactions with third parties of this kind is that it seems to me, maybe this will bring us to the second intimacy defense, is that it seems more likely that you and your partner will connect over these things if in fact they're not doing so with others. So there's a few factors that I think go into defining intimacy. One of them is the frequency of influence you have over each other and the diversity of influence that you have over each other, meaning you connect over all kinds of different things. So I think that if you sort of have one partner with whom you do this and one partner with whom you do that, it's going to decrease the diversity of influence that you have with any particular partner. And as well as the frequency of influence, right? Because the more partners you have, you're just going to have to interact with all of them less. And even if you're in a group setting, you can only really pay attention to one person at a time usually. So I think that having a pre-existing agreement to limit the other sorts of romantic, intimate relationships you're going to enter into with other people, certainly, like, it's sad that they won't get to have these nice experiences. That's why monogamy has to be justified, right? But what I'm saying is that there does seem to be value that gets promoted by missing out on these other things.
I have a few things I could say in response to that, but I want to check in with you first, Amos. Would that be okay, or do you think we should move on?
Yeah, no, that's fine. You respond, and then Kyle have the last word, because I think you had the last word on the last topic. Okay.
Okay. So for the first thing you said, this was about third parties, that it's not obvious that it's a harm to them not to be able to have the relationship with your partner, because if they don't have you, then presumably they can just have other people. But the issue that I see there is that this seems to be treating relationships essentially as fungible. That, oh, if they don't have me, they'll just find someone else. But I think even if they do find someone else, that element of loss, of not having a relationship with you, not getting to see all of your unique qualities, then I think that remains a loss that can't just be waved aside. For the point about selfishness, so you said it's not about wanting your partner not to have significant interactions with others. It's just about promoting a third value of being especially close to your partner. And I think that's right, that people who embrace monogamous restrictions are not going into it thinking so much of, oh, it's a good thing that my partner is missing out. They're at least charitably construed. Their motivation is more like, oh, well, we want to be especially close to each other, and that seems like a good thing that justifies the sacrifices of monogamy. Here, though, I would say what the selfishness seems to me to consist in is simply the fact that to promote that third value, or not even to promote that third value, but that value of being especially close, but to promote it even just a slight extent, the extent to which you know your partner better if you know their conversations with this particular person, that just for the sake of that, one is willing to preclude one's partner from having an entire additional, very fulfilling relationship with someone else. To me, that very weighing, it might have good motivations behind it, but I think in that very weighing, it is just, there's a certain selfishness there. And then lastly, you mentioned that that there are certain factors that affect intimacy, such as the frequency and diversity of interactions, and that the more partners you have, then you'll be interacting with each partner less. And I mean, this might be true as a general matter. I'm not sure it's always true. I think in any relationship, there are natural pauses from one another throughout the day or the week or the month. And even in a monogamous relationship, partners aren't always spending time with each other. Sometimes they're with friends, sometimes they're out by themselves. And in a non-monogamous relationship, perhaps the time they spend with their other partners could just fill in those natural pauses to a large extent. So I would say that I think helps address this point somewhat. But perhaps a more important response is that, to me, intimacy or closeness seems to come much, much more from the quality of the interactions than it does from sheer quantity. And I can say a few things to back that up. I mean, it's not just, I think, a feature of my experience, but I suspect that probably for just about all of us, we've had the experience of feeling pretty close to someone very soon after meeting them, when it's clear that there's a certain compatibility of natures, or if you have a really high quality interaction. Whereas by contrast, you might have someone else who's simply an acquaintance, and you might, over a long period of time, come to know just about everything about them. But still, the relationship might be fairly superficial if there's just not that deep sharing of values. And so to me, intimacy is much less a matter of whether you know everything about your partner than it is of whether there's a deep trust between you. And I think people sometimes confuse this because when you're sharing, intimate details with your partner in a conversation, for example, people will sometimes say, oh, isn't that the source of the intimacy, of knowing these deep details? But it seems to me the real source of the intimacy is the fact that your partner trusts you enough to share these details with you. And so I think that given that the closeness comes much more from the quality than the quantity, it's just not clear to me that being non-monogamous would pose any significant threat to the closeness of the partners.
Okay, so yeah, I didn't want to imply that to the third party, you or your partner would be a replaceable good. I guess I was thinking more in terms of preventing outside relationships ahead of time would make it so that there wouldn't be any relationship to whom that which to them would be irreplaceable yet. But yeah, so if I did imply that, I didn't want to. I do worry that maybe that consideration about other people missing out might prove too much. So let's say that I talk to somebody at a party and I think, oh man, I love talking to this person. I want to keep talking to them throughout this party. But actually, now they're missing out and other people are missing out on them. and that's kind of, I'm harming other people at the party because those other people don't get to talk to this person now. Now you might say, well, the point is that I'm not restricting this person in the party, right? I'm not like forcing them to only talk to me. But it seems like what the consideration that we're talking about here is just the missing out of other people. So I'm wondering if like, right, so it seems like the harm is not coming from the restriction, right? Because the restriction is, as you conceive it, the restriction is happening as a mutual agreement between two partners, not involving any outsiders. But like, I guess like if I dated somebody, or if I like started dating somebody, would I be harming other people in the community by like making them less available to date? So I'm not sure. Like I worry that maybe that consideration of like harming third parties, especially in terms of opportunity costs, might prove too much. But it's something I'd have to think about more. It's kind of a new consideration. Okay,
Can I clarify something about the objection? It is the question you're asking whether withholding yourself from the community is a harm or whether it's a wrongful harm. Like, are you asking, does it just meet the definition of harm? Because I don't know, on a standard counterfactual comparative account of harm, it seems like it clearly counts as a harm because some people are being made worse off than they otherwise would have been by you withdrawing yourself. But is your question really whether or not it technically counts as a harm? Is it a wrongful harm? What are you asking?
Yeah, no, that's a very good way of putting it. Because it could be harm through opportunity costs, but then if we started to take that sort of harm into account, then we might start to worry about harms done to other people just by like taking somebody out on a date and taking them out of the dating pool for that night or whatever. I don't know. So what was the other thing I was going to say? Okay. Yeah, that it would be selfish. I think that Harry was saying it would be selfish to like not want to just want your partner to not have fulfilling conversations with other people just so that you won't miss out on them. So certainly I think that would be a selfish motivation. What I conceive of as the intimacy consideration is two partners deciding together that over the course of their life they want to share a certain kind of personal and private experiences and conversations with each other, at least primarily, rather than having them be diffuse over many different sorts of people. And so I don't take that sort of general motivation that they have when they enter into that kind of agreement to be selfish. I think that it's just the decision to promote one sort of valuable thing in life, which is to have this one person that you're super intimate with over another sort of valuable thing in life, which is to have intimacy with many different people, even if it's a bit more diffuse. So the last point is that quantity influence may be more less. Sorry, quantity may be more less important than quality when it comes to interactions. Sure, that seems true. I think to a certain extent the quantity of interactions might influence the quality, but the main thing that I would just say in response is that I think that there's just no getting around the fact that when it comes to defining intimacy, and I'm not trying to give even a qualitative account of intimacy. I'm just trying to say what I think intimacy is that it depends on having a high frequency of interactions that are also diverse across many different domains. And that this diversity across domains might be one of the things that ensures that it has a good quality in the way that you're thinking about it. But I think I'll leave it there, and maybe we can move on to the next one. Okay, in which case I guess I'll keep talking. So the last consideration is specialness. I think that the course of the debate with Harry has really gotten me to think really hard about this and try to figure out what actually people have in mind when they talk about specialness, because my response in the newer paper is very different than the response in the first paper. We could just talk about the response in the first paper first, and maybe Harry can respond to that first. So the first thing I was thinking of is just like, okay, so the initial claim is that being in a exclusive relationship makes it more special. So Harry, and also I hope I get her name right, Hallie Liberto, have both written on this and said like it seems for one thing kind of objectifying to think that exclusivity makes a relationship more special, because other people are going to have more limited access to something that somehow raises the value of it. And then the other I think more basic point that Harry wants to make is that he just doesn't see why. Like, why should exclusivity make a relationship more special? Now, the initial response I gave was just that maybe sometimes we just have these associations. Like, we just associate sex with a certain sort of closeness and intimacy. That might just be a psychological fact about people. And that if it is a psychological fact about people, it at least gives us a defeatable reason to consider exclusivity to be a source of specialness. So I'll just start there. I have a better reason later, but I'll let Harry respond to that first.
Right. So, yeah, for that, I mean, of course, it's true. So sometimes we do just have certain associations, and when it comes to associating sex, for example, with specialness or a special kind of closeness, then I mean, there's a sense in which I agree with that, as long as we're using special to mean highly valuable. Of course, if we're using special in that sense, then it's not clear that there's any exclusivity at play. If by special we mean exclusive, then that's kind of where I would start to question
Mhm.
whether we do have that association. Or, I mean, I guess you could say many people still do, but then to me, my response to that would be that when an association itself seems problematic, then I think we have reason to reject the association, reason to work on not having it. And in the case of exclusivity, I mean, it does seem to be problematic for the kinds of reasons I've been describing about, wouldn't it be a more loving attitude toward your partner to let them be open to, having these additional relationships. Now, I know that's just kind of the start of the dialectic, and there's a lot to be said in response to that. So if you want to continue from there, Kyle, that's fine.
Okay, sure. So so I think the most important point to make here is that the most important difference between our views is I think that there actually could be like reason why exclusivity is an indicator of specialness, at least in that I take it to track more specific criteria of when you're going to, let's say, start to date somebody. So I'll give this thought experiment. Maybe we can start with that. So here's a couple cases. One of them is, so in both cases, the musician Beck hears you playing guitar at a party and invites you to play guitar on his new album. And so then in the first case, you show up at his studio and it turns out that there's like 100 other guitarists there. And it's some sort of, big orchestral thing. And then in the second case, you show up and it's just you and him. And so I would say in the first case, if you were expecting yourself to be in the second case, but you found yourself to be in the first case, you would feel disappointed because you thought that maybe you were picked out with a less general criteria. You thought that maybe he really like wanted you in particular to play, but now it seems like like he's having a bunch of people playing the album, and it's not really as special that you're going to be on there. So I think it'd be rational to feel disappointed if you thought you would be in the second case, but you found yourself to be in the first case.
Okay, so yeah, I really like this case that you had in your most recent paper, and there are a few things that I would say in response to it. One of them is that I think there's something going on in the case that's influencing our intuitions. That's beside the point the case is trying to make. And in particular, it's that if you go to the recording session and you see the 100 other guitarists there, then yeah, I agree, I would be disappointed. But I think that would be in large part because when I see the 100 other people there, I know I'm not going to get much personal time with Beck. And so I think and that's independent from the matter of whether one is chosen exclusively. And so I think to sort of bracket that, we should imagine that you come to the recording session, it's just you there, but you find out that he's invited a bunch of other people to come by on different days. And so to me, the big question is like, would there be a significant disappointment if that were the case? I think that also just makes it more analogous to non-monogamy because in most non-monogamous relationships, one is not going to be spending time with all of one's partners
Yeah.
at once, especially not if one has 100. So anyway, just with that modification of the case, now we can ask, would there be any disappointment in finding out that he had invited a bunch of other musicians to come by on different days when you previously thought he'd invited only you? Now, I actually can see a sense of, I think my previous point helps, but I can sort of sympathize with the intuition that, just with that information so far, not knowing anything else, if the only difference is knowing whether you were exclusively chosen, then I think that would give you at least some reason to find yourself being, especially highly valued, let's say. And so what I think that suggests is that, at least in certain circumstances of, extremely limited information, like if the only relevant piece of information here is whether you were chosen exclusively for something, then perhaps that can communicate certain information about to what extent one is valued. So I'm willing to concede that point. But I think that when it comes to real world cases, they're not going to be like this. Of course, in real world cases, there's a lot more information that one knows. And particularly when it comes to deciding how greatly one is valued by one's partner, how special that relationship is, to me, there's just something very bizarre about the thought of ever considering whether the relationship is exclusive as bearing on that question, whether my partner happens to be seeing other people. And that's because to see how special the relationship is, I can just look at the quality of our interactions. That's a much fuller source of information that is not only so much deeper, but I think deeper in a way that actually cancels any information the exclusivity might have communicated. To draw a parallel, it's a bit like if you look at the cover of a book and it has kind of a sensationalized title and the author is listed as so-and-so Ph.D., includes the Ph.D. Well, maybe that gives you some indication that, the book isn't very academically serious, but suppose that you read it and you find that it is very well argued, well written. You check all the citations, they all check out. It makes a really good case. Well, I would say in a case like that, it's not as if you have two competing reasons for belief of, the cover makes it the case to a certain extent that you should believe this is not an academically serious book, but your reading of the book gives you another reason to believe that it is. It's just the information the cover communicated is canceled. And I think in the case of relationships, there's a similar dynamic. So to apply that to the case of Beck, here's just a way of extending the case that I think helps make my point clearer. Imagine that you get invited to the recording session and it's just you for that day, but you find out he's invited a bunch of other musicians that he also thinks highly of. But suppose you work with him for several days. It's not just a one-day thing, and you get to know him well, and he gives you a lot of personal attention, a lot of praise for your musicianship, and you come to find out that he's also a very honest person, and he's not just saying this to flatter you, that he really does think highly of you as a musician. Now, I think the question is, in a case like this, would you be disappointed to know that he's invited other people, to know that he also thinks highly of other musicians? And I don't think that I would. I think I would have all the information I need just from our personal relationship and the fact that he obviously does think so highly of me. Now, you can say, true, I might not be judged as the best in a case like this, but my view is, so what? I think what mattered all along about being judged the best was that it would be a confirmation that I'm an extremely good musician. And that's a confirmation I would still have in this version of the case. What mattered was never the assurance that everyone else is worse than I am. I think to back that up, we can just imagine, a monkey's paw type situation where I'm the best, but only because everyone else is awful. That wouldn't mean a whole lot.
Mhm.
And so I think that when we look at that version of considering the case, then it's not clear to me that it really does provide much support for specialness as a defense of monogamy.
Cool. Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points, and this is all stuff that we haven't really got to talk about yet, so it's going to give me a lot to think about. And I'm not sure if I have any definitive response now, but I'll give some initial responses. So I guess I'm thinking about just to clarify, do you take it that so I guess you wouldn't feel very disappointed if it turned out that Beck had a bunch of other musicians coming on different days. I guess to me, it's one thing is that maybe exclusivity can be an indicator of just how special somebody is to you, particularly if you have a limited amount of people in mind that you're going to be uh, interacting with. So let's say that there's maybe I can change the thought experiment again. Uh, let's say that it's going to be an album that only has one other musician on it, and it turns out that he's decided that you're going to be that other musician on the album. Versus a case where it turns out that he does want to work with you, but you're just going to be giving one instrumentation on one particular song, and that there's going to be other musicians on the other songs. No, it'll still be great. I mean, like, I wouldn't complain about it or anything. I just think that maybe you would feel even more special or especially valued if it turned out that you and him were doing the whole album together.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few things in response. Is that okay, Amos? Or I'm happy to let you also have the last word on this, Kyle, if whatever you guys think would be best.
It's okay. Yeah.
I'll give you the last word on it, even if I have a response, because I took it at least the last time, if not the last 2 times.
Okay, so yeah, an album. So there was a comparison here between an album that only has one other musician on it, and he's picked you, versus a case where he wants to work with you, but you've just been given the instrumentation on one song and other musicians on the other songs. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be willing to concede that if that were the only piece of information that you had here, then perhaps that would make you be right to feel more valued in the case where he just picks you. But I think that would make the case not analogous to real life relationships where we have much more information than that about to what extent our partner values us. And so I think that to continue with the bet case, once we add the stipulation that you get to know him well and have a lot of interactions, and it's clear that he really does think highly of your musicianship, I think the mere fact that he finds other people worth inviting to me, that just has no bearing at all. And I would say that in part because of 2 further points. One of them is that, suppose he's invited many other musicians, but just imagine that he tells you, these other musicians, they were good enough to be invited, but you're the best. Well, in that version of the case, I think there would just be no reason at all to feel disappointed that he also found others good enough to invite. And I mention that case because that seems to me analogous to hierarchical non-monogamy, where someone chooses you as a primary partner. And so that dynamic, I think, would be reproduced in cases of non-monogamy like that. And even for cases of non-monogamy that are not like that, there's just a further point I would raise, which is that, like, you brought up the case of, like, imagine he's invited other musicians to work on other songs. I think part of what's important here is what kind of musicians they are. Like, if you're a guitarist and he's invited a bunch of other guitarists, I can see how maybe you could try to set up the case that way to push this defense of monogamy. I don't think it would ultimately succeed, but I can at least see, like, what the case would be, what its rationale would be. But when it comes to actual non-monogamous relationships, it's not as if each partner, a non-monogamous person, contributes to their life in the same way. There's a very rich diversity of the ways that we can contribute value to each other's lives. And so I think in the case of Beck, what we should be imagining is not that he's invited a bunch of guitarists, but that he's invited you as a guitarist, but also a backup singer, but also a drummer, also someone to manage the soundboard and so on. And when we set up the case that way, it just seems even clearer to me that you have no reason to be disappointed that he also finds those kinds of musicians worth inviting.
Cool. No, I mean, these are all, like, very interesting responses and stuff I'm going to think about a lot more, especially if we continue, writing together in this kind of way. I guess I'm just going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to give you the last word. Well, I'll say 2 more things. I'm wondering if your intuitions would be changed at all if it turned out that you were kind of a multi-instrumentalist, as I suppose most people are. And then, so you play xylophone, you play guitar, you play drums. And then in the one case, you know, you're contributing many very different instrumental tracks to different tracks. And then in the other case, you contribute guitar to one, but he still gets a better xylophonist or a different xylophonist. Let's say it's a different xylophonist, but he still tells you you're still the best musician. Don't worry. But you're still like really only on one or two songs. I would still feel kind of like not as, I mean, I would be psyched in either case, but I'd be more psyched if in the first case, even if he did tell me that I was the best musician or something. And then I had one other case that I didn't end up putting in the paper, but I would just be interested in your take on. So here's the other case. Like you're at a coffee shop, you see Tilda Swinton. You guys share like a really awesome conversation all night. And you're like, holy crap, like I guess we had a really special connection. And then, you know, after she leaves, the coffee shop like barista is like, oh yeah, Tilda Swinton, she's just like that. She talks to a new person, has a super deep conversation with them every night. I'd feel like a little less excited in that case because I think, oh, this is just something that like she does, you know. But you know, I'm going to give you the last word and see if you have responses to these adjustments in cases.
Okay, so yeah, in a case of like yeah, if you're the best musician, but he gets a different xylophonist for a certain track, I mean, I'm starting to wonder now whether the case is to what extent it's analogous to non-monogamy, or to me it seems like the kind of non-monogamy that would be analogous to is perhaps either finding out that you're a secondary partner, or maybe just even if you're a primary, someone tells you, oh, such and such person is you know, better at sex, but you know, like, but you're still really good, you know. Then yeah, I mean, I don't think like just finding out that someone is better than I am at something, to me that doesn't matter if I have you know, I also have confirmation that I'm really good at it, especially if there's, you know, the potential for improving myself. I think I would just view it as a motivation to, you know, to better myself in the relevant ways. So you know, if someone tells me that, hey, look, I think there are better philosophers than you, then I mean, of course I would agree with that. But yeah, it just doesn't seem to me it wouldn't make me crestfallen finding out that that others are a better philosopher than I am in certain ways. Like it all I think depends on what the reason is. If the reason why there are better philosophers than I am is that just in absolute terms, I'm just a bad philosopher, then yeah, that would make me feel really bad. But if the reason is like, hey, they think I'm a really good philosopher, it's just these others are even better, then yeah, to me that really would not affect how I feel about it. For the Tilda Swinton example, yeah, finding out that she has deep conversations with someone every night at the coffee shop, I also don't think that would influence my feelings about it at all. And I've thought about this in light of a perhaps even more extreme case, which is if we imagine that my partner is someone who can somehow transcend space and time and visit parallel universes, and suppose that she's in a relationship with infinitely many more partners at a given time. You know, would finding this out change the way I feel about our relationship? And to me, it wouldn't. As long as we stipulate the same quality of interactions, that you know, we have many high quality interactions with each other. There's that same degree of love for each other, of closeness. Then, however many additional partners she has, to me, that just would have no bearing on how close I feel our relationship is. If anything, I would just feel privileged and wondrous to be in the presence of someone with such an endless heart.
That's a very beautiful thought and very interesting example, and I look forward to talking and thinking about this more.
Sure. And by the way, just to any listeners, I mean, I know you mentioned this earlier, Kyle, but just to kind of reinforce it, there's a certain unfair advantage that I have here, which is that, you know, Kyle, your paper was the last one published, and I've had time to, you know, think about all these things a lot. And a lot of these thoughts that I'm introducing, you know, you haven't really encountered before. So I just want listeners to be aware of that. And I appreciate you saying that I've given you some things to think about. And you should know that the feeling is very much mutual. So you've given me a lot to think about, and really appreciate the thoughts and the challenges that you've raised.
Okay, well, I'm going to put the titles of both of your papers in the description below. do you have any final comments, either of you, on the topic of the debate or the debate itself before we close up?
Do you want to start, Kyle?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would say that, I mean, the thoughts that I've been gesturing at in this conversation are certainly the primary arguments that I have against monogamy. And when I think about, other considerations there, I don't think this is the only plausible argument against monogamy, but one argument that I've recently been thinking of, that I'm still working on, is if we imagine, I mean, it has to do with third parties, so maybe in a way it touches on something that I've said, but just to kind of start with a thought experiment, if we imagine 3 people on an island and they're the only ones on it and have no way of leaving, and suppose that 2 of the people are in a monogamous relationship, but we also imagine that the third person is sexually and romantically compatible with one or perhaps even both of the other people on the island. So they would have a mutually fulfilling relationship if they were to pursue it. Now, with that initial description of the case, I think most people probably wouldn't see a problem, but I do think there's a real question here of, would it be okay for the other 2 people to be monogamous in this situation, given that one result of it would be that the third person is shut out from sex and relationships altogether, that now they have to live their life alone. And I want to be clear that what's wrong there would not be a rights violation. It would not be a matter of the third person being having a right to sex and relationships that she's being denied, but it would simply be a matter of being forced to miss out on something that would plausibly contribute to her well-being very significantly. And so what this amounts to is that I think in cases like that, monogamy will be more difficult to justify. Now, one might wonder, okay, so perhaps we can concede that, but like, how analogous is that to the real world, where people are not on islands, and if they miss out on a relationship with someone else, they can just find an additional partner. And I mean, that's right as far as it goes, but I do wonder whether something like this case on the island is going on perhaps more often than we think. So I'm thinking in particular of just someone who's not very romantically compatible with most people, but only relatively few. And perhaps all the people nearby him who would be compatible with him are already in monogamous relationships, which wouldn't be a surprise, given how dominant monogamy is. Well, that's going to make it infeasible for him to have a relationship at all, unless perhaps he moves to another state or another country, which would itself be a large cost to find himself imposed with. I think this is especially a problem in cases where sex ratios are skewed and where most people are straight. And so a widespread acceptance of monogamy in such cases will lead to a state of there, not being enough women or not being enough men. And in that case, I think we tend to forget that monogamy is one crucial ingredient there. Because if it weren't for monogamy, then the fact that a given person is already in a relationship would not by itself be an obstacle to other people forming relationships with them. And so I think that there is perhaps an argument to be made here, and that even for those who still do have some romantic prospects, being shut out from relationships with the people they would have found most fulfilling, if those other people are already in monogamous relationships, I think there's a fair case to be made that that is itself still a significant cost of monogamy, and something that, while perhaps not decisive, I think would make it more challenging to justify. So for all these reasons, I think that our moral obligation is to be non-monogamous, but I do recognize there are serious points to be made on both sides. And yeah, with that, I'll leave it to you, Kyle, if there's anything you want to say.
Cool. Yeah. No, I think that is interesting, and it's going to be good to think about third parties. It's kind of interesting that I know some people have said that monogamy sort of originally partially served as a solution to the fact that there were a bunch of people who didn't have partners, because usually polygamy was the case, usually in like patriarchal societies. And I'm just wondering if like the imbalance of sexes and or genders in certain societies would still be like better addressed by eliminating the maybe sexist related reasons for the imbalance, such as like selective, wanting to have more boys than girls or as opposed to girls. But I do think that you bring up some interesting points, and that it's plausible to me that there could be some cases where non-monogamy would be a morally superior consideration just for those third parties. I think that's that seems like very plausibly the case on the island. And so, maybe the final thing I would want to say is that in a certain sense, I have a much easier job because I'm totally fine with saying that non-monogamy can be a good thing, and it can also be preferable in some circumstances. All I want to say is that in many other circumstances, monogamy can also be a preferable or justified or reasonable thing to do. There's an aphorism from Kierkegaard that I end one essay with, which is marry or don't marry, you'll regret it either way. And I think it's very true in the sense that no matter what form of relationship that you choose, there's going to be some valuable things that you'll get from that and some valuable things that you'll miss out on. And, very roughly, maybe in monogamy, you'll get things like more specialness, intimacy, and commitment. But in non-monogamy, you'll get freedom, novelty, communality, and some other valuable things. Although I know that Harry may not characterize those particular benefits as the key benefits to non-monogamy. But in my view, I think that it's going to be which one that you're going to endorse is going to be a hypothetical imperative that depends on the desires and the personalities of the people involved, as well as maybe the social context too. I guess I'll end my statement there. But it's been very fun to have this debate, and it's made me think a lot more about my own views. So.
Okay, well, I want to say a massive thank you to both my guests. So thank you, Harry, and thank you, Kyle. It's been a great discussion.
You.
Absolutely.
And everyone watching, if you would just subscribe, and comment something nice about my jumper. This has been Ends and Means. Over and out.